Hello, everyone. So, I feel like a explanation is in order for this. So, some time ago, Blizzard released a remaster of the original StarCraft. Now, I, at the time, decided not to do it because I really was not that impressed with what they did, because it was basically just, they just kind of made the colors stand out a little bit more. It really didn't feel like a remaster to me, except for the portraits. I was ecstatic over the changes to some of the portraits, especially the Queen Blade's portrait, but we'll get there. Recently, we went... recently we had a anniversary for both this game as well as for Blizzard. Recently, StarCraft celebrated its 20th anniversary, and Blizzard is about to celebrate its 30th anniversary. So, it got me feeling a little nostalgic. I also looked back at my old StarCraft playthroughs. Now, I am very happy with the way those turned out. However, there are a couple of things. I did those on my older machine, so on StarCraft 1 it wasn't really that much of an issue, but when we got to StarCraft 2, that's where things didn't look all that great, because, well, I wasn't really able to play the game on pretty high settings back then on that older machine. However, on the one I'm using now, I'm actually able to run StarCraft 2 on like max settings if I wanted to. It's fully capable of that. And I thought, you know what? There was also the whole thing of, well, there were other options. Now, I went through what happens if you chose the other options, but I thought, you know what, why don't we, if I ever get around to perhaps doing another run of that, why don't we do the alternate choices? So here's what I thought. I thought, why don't we, for nostalgia's sake, because it's been some years since Legacy of the Void has come out, and basically nothing has happened other than the Nova campaign, which wasn't all that... it wasn't really all that, how do I put this? I didn't quite enjoy that campaign as much as I wanted to compared to, say, the rest of the campaigns. But we'll get there. That's a separate thing. But that's basically been it since then. We've had some co-op commander stuff, but in terms of story stuff, that's basically been it. A lot of people have been saying that StarCraft is basically dead at this point. I also did Legacy of the Void when it came out, so it was kind of a live reaction. It's been some years where now we can kind of look back and kind of look at the whole story, you know, from taking a step back and looking at it from a much broader and wider perspective, seeing the beginning of the story to the end of the story. Now, there is some extra stuff that is, of course, in some of the books that I will want to try and share. Because, see, that's the thing. I actually have been wanting to learn a bit more about the backstory and the lore on some things to be able to kind of like interject some of it into this playthrough as kind of a more informative playthrough of, well, this is what happened and this is why this happened, because some of the stuff does not really come through in the games. It's only in the books. Like, you don't really learn about the actual backstory between Raynor and Tychus, for example, unless you've read the books, which has some pretty significant stuff and lets you know how awesome of a character that Tychus is, but we'll get there. The point is that while we go through these again, that I'm going to try to kind of interject something. So the intent here is that we're going to go through StarCraft Remastered so I can show the changes that they did for the original StarCraft, and then we'll go through StarCraft 2 again. We'll make some alternate choices in the first two campaigns, maybe even in the third one as well. Plus, you won't be getting my reaction to things, me seeing things happen for the first time in Legacy of the Void. It'll be more so like, this is what, I know what's coming and I know what's going to happen, and therefore it's a different perspective kind of thing, But to start things off, I thought what would be fun is that we do some reading, because back in the day, Blizzard and other games used to include these manuals, not necessarily just this is how you play the game, but more so actual backstory and lore for the game and what you were going to be the world you were getting yourself into. And Blizzard did this with their main games. They did this with Diablo, they did this with Warcraft, and they did this with Starcraft. And other games have done this as well. I believe games like Age of Empires also had manuals that had tons of backstory and lore that you could just almost read it like an actual book, like, oh, this is good stuff here. So, before we get into the actual games, I thought what would be fun is if we take a look at the history sections of each race in the StarCraft manual. I did not have the game back in the day, but I did find a copy of it here online, so I could be able to kind of read it for you guys, so we can get a bit more actual backstory as to what was going on with the races before the actual original game started. And by the way, I have the game in the background playing music very lightly. You can hardly hear it when I'm talking, but it is there. So anyways, Terrans. The decline of Western civilization. Although technology and world culture progressed rapidly throughout the 20th century, their advancements paled in comparison to the seemingly reckless leaps that would follow. By the end of the 21st century, mankind had seen bold and unprecedented changes within the world. Radical new technologies were surfacing at incredible rates, offering increased access to advanced computers and informational databases to even the most destitute nations of Earth. In the wake of the eradication of communism from the Eastern nations, nuclear weapons quickly became available in abundance. The international power structure, once defined primarily by the acquisition of capital and military superiority, was blasted apart as Third World nations rose to challenge the economic and military might of the world's superpowers. As the manipulative sciences of cybernetics, cloning, and gene splicing rose steadily in the public forum, militant humanists and hardline religious groups challenged the rights of private interest corporations who profited from genetic experimentation. Multitudes of people were being augmented with cybernetic implants, while others began to manifest slight physical mutations, ranging from heightened senses to advanced telepathy. These dramatic changes within the human gene pool caused widespread panic amongst many of the fundamental humanist factions. Technology continued to evolve and spread, and population rates soared. Near the end of the 20th century, there were 6 billion people upon the Earth. Within 300 years, the population had grown to an estimated 23 billion. Pollution and a lack of natural resources and affordable fuels added to the fire as the world leaders sought ways to stem the growth of their nation's inhabitants. Popular sentiment held that the world was plummeting towards an inevitable catastrophe as overpopulation and genetic alteration swept across the globe. Meanwhile, as tensions rose around the world regarding the use and capitalization of cybernetics and genetic mutations, many core international economic systems folded in upon themselves and shut down. Horrific acts of terrorism and violence erupted between the corporate sector and the humanist factions, resulting in forced police actions across the globe. Irresponsible media coverage of these atrocious police actions spurred the already rampant civil chaos in many of the larger countries. Ultimately, the precarious balance of world power exploded into international pandemonium. The New Order. On November 22nd, 2229, the United Powers League was founded. The UPL was to become the ultimate incarnation of the vision of a unified humanity held by the now defunct United Nations. This new order encompassed and controlled close to 93% of the Earth's population, failing only to bring order to a few volatile South American states. The UPL was founded upon the basis of enlightened socialism, but often resorted to harsh fascist police actions to maintain the public order. With its control lasting for nearly 80 years, the UPL began to devise a rigid agenda that would unify the various cultures of humanity for all time. Great lengths were taken to eradicate the last vestiges of racial separatism, and the Unitariate Commissions banned many of the world's oldest religions. English was designated as the common tongue of the planet, replacing many ancient languages that were subsequently banned in their native countries. I just want to point out, this is kind of a very humorous way to explain why everyone is speaking English. Because usually in other forms of fiction, people are just speaking English, and you're like, why are they speaking English? Shouldn't they be speaking this other language? So here we go. This is kind of a funny little explanation as to why everyone's talking English. Although religions were officially banned by the UPL, the organization held an almost zealous belief in the supposed divinity of mankind. This quasi-religious dogma called for the immediate eradication of any non-vital prosthetics or mutations amongst the pure strain human gene pool. Hardline UPL proponents and scholars argued that genetic alteration, cyber technology, and the use of psychoactive drugs all led to the eventual degeneration of the human species. The UPL leaders formulated a bold plan that would assure that humanity would persevere unscathed by the tempting corruption of radical technologies. The Great Purification. Like the bloody inquisitions that devastated Europe 800 years before, the UPL set in motion one of the harshest agendas ever conceived by humanity: Project Purification. This genocidal crusade was the government's final solution to the matter of cleansing humanity of its more degenerate facets. UPL's troops scoured every nation on Earth, rounding up dissidents, hackers, synthetics, the cybernetically enhanced, tech pirates, and criminals of every kind. This planet-wide culling resulted in the eradication of nearly 400 million people. The world media, now under the strict control of the UPL, downplayed the horrific violence and kept the general populace of Earth unaware of the scope of the atrocities being committed. Despite their heinous acts, the UPL succeeded in advancing many core technologies. Fields of research that had lain dormant for decades were opened again under UPL control. The space exploration programs of the mid-20th century, abandoned by the American and Russian governments due to drastically reduced budgets and incessant political sabotage, became the basis for a new era of exploration for humanity. The coupling of cryogenic hibernation with warp drive technology resulted in the ability to travel amongst the stars. Within the span of 40 years, the UPL founded colonies upon the Moon and many of the other planets within the Terran solar system. Well, there you go, guys. We just have to become a Warhammer 40k fascist population and culture in order to get back to outer space. Yes, you can see the parallels. Remember, Blizzard did draw a lot of inspiration from Warhammer and Warhammer 40k when it came to making Warcraft and Starcraft. So if you're seeing some similarities here, that's kind of obvious, and they've even admitted this up front. During this period, a brilliant young scientist named Samir Duran, Doran Ruth, made plans to consolidate his power within the UPL. Uninvolved with the vulgarities of Project Purification, Ruth was obsessed with founding colonies upon the worlds found beyond the Terran sector. Ruth was convinced that the discovery of new minerals, and alternate fuel sources on the outlying worlds would make him one of the most influential men on Earth. Through his political connections and personal fortune, Ruth was able to secure thousands of UPL prisoners to use as guinea pigs for his secret plans. If you're not picking up on why I jokingly first called him Samir Duran, which some of you may also know as Dr. Narud, that's because I honestly believe that this is actually who this is. Because, well, as you're going to see, a lot of this is not really feasible to be it just happened, or just coincidence. It's actually more likely to believe that a lot of this was actually manipulated and set up by, well, you know who. The prisoners slated for mass execution under the Edict of Project Purification were transported to Ruth's private laboratories. Ruth, planning on sending the prisoners off to colonize the outlying worlds, had his science crews prep nearly 56,000 people for long-term cryogenic hibernation. Cataloging the various mutations and cybernetic enhancements of the prisoners, Ruth input all the data into a revolutionary supercomputer. This artificial telepathic logistics analysis system, also known as Atlas, then processed this genetic information and was able to predict which of the prisoners should be able to survive the trial to come. Only 40,000 of the prisoners were deemed viable to survive the rigorous conditions. Those 40,000 were then loaded onto 4 gargantuan automated deep space supercarriers. As the prisoners were prepped for cryogenic cold sleep and the ships were loaded with enough supplies, rations, and hardware to aid them once they arrived at their scheduled destination, the navigation computer was then programmed with the coordinates of the outlying planet Gantris 6. All seemed in perfect preparation, but even Ruth could not have imagined that the prisoners would be launched into their almost certain deaths in the galactic rim. Yeah. The Exiles and the Long Sleep. The Atlas was installed into the first of the supercarriers, the Naglfar. 3 other carriers, the Argo and the Serengo and the Reagan, were programmed to follow the Naglfar as it was launched into the void of space towards Gantris 6. Over the course of this journey, which later generations would call the Long Sleep, Atlas continued to monitor the humans kept in cryogenic stasis. Evaluating the numerous mutations and enhancements found within the prisoner's gene pool, Atlas became aware of a powerful mutagenic strain that existed in some of their DNA. While this mutation was found to reside in less than 1% of the prisoners, it seemed to augment the latent psionic potential within the human brain. Atlas calculated that should the prisoners survive in their new environment, many of them might benefit from this psionic mutation within only a few generations. These findings were recorded and relayed back to Earth, straight into the logs of Doran Ruth. Interesting that they are all going to him, of all people. Originally scheduled as a 1-year trip, their voyage took a turn for the worse. At some point during the journey, the navigational systems linked to Atlas shut down, erasing not only the coordinates of Gantris 6, but those of the Earth as well. The 4 ships carrying their hapless cargo in stasis barreled blindly through space at warp speeds for nearly 30 years. I'm just going to reiterate this point I made earlier. There's no way this is just a coincidence. This is all completely part of Samir Duran's plan. Now, some have asked, why is it Duran would care about the Terrans? Because of their psionic genetic mutations and potential. After all, we see that because Kerrigan was such a gifted psionic, that it was, part of his plan to get her to be taken by the Swarm, to have her become the Queen of Blades, and then use that to resurrect Amon. Those are one of his 2 long-term goals, which is the hybrids and resurrecting Amon. And we know that he uses Kerrigan primarily for this. So, the other thing here is that there's no way that 4 ships just, by coincidence, lose the location of Gantris, lose the location of Earth. They barrel at faster than light speed for over 30 years, and they each land on planets in the same area, the Kaprulu sector. The astronomical odds of this actually being a success on its, just successfully happening just by coincidence? No. I'm convinced that this was Duran's plan, because, of course, he would have the know-how and the technology to be able to accomplish this. After all, look at how involved he has been as Doran Ruth in making all this happen. Eventually, the warp drive engines of the 4 supercarriers reached critical meltdown. After 28 years of warp travel, the huge ships emerged into real space near the edge of a habitable star system. Some 60,000 light years from the Earth, 60,000 light years from the Earth. Their engines destroyed and their life support batteries nearly exhausted, the ships engaged their emergency protocols and plummeted towards the nearest habitable worlds in the system. The Reagan and the Serengo crash-landed on the world that would be named Umoja. The Serengo, which had suffered massive system failures during its atmospheric descent, smashed into the planet, killing all of its 8,000 passengers. The Reagan was more fortunate, making a controlled descent and landing safely. Once the ship had landed, the cold sleep chambers were deactivated and the surviving passengers slowly awakened. The passengers, attempting to discern where they were and how long they had slept, found that the Atlas system had somehow erased all knowledge of their journey from their computer banks. The Argo landed upon the red world of Moira. Its passengers met with the same fate as those aboard the Reagan, as all information regarding their current status were erased. Only the passengers of the Naglfar could access their ship's computers to discern their plight. They accessed Atlas directly and confirmed their growing suspicions that they would never... There's a little interesting little portrait here. Never see the Earth again. For although they had landed on the temperate planet of Tarsonis, the Naglfar was damaged beyond repair. The surviving exiles, now spread across 3 worlds, began to salvage their wrecked ships in an attempt to find refuge in their new surroundings. The Confederacy and the New World. The inhabitants of each planet worked to survive in what they termed the New World. Unaware that their fellows also thrived upon the other worlds in the system, the vagabond Terrans made do with whatever meager resources they could find. Having lost the means to communicate over interplanetary distances when their ships were stripped for essential minerals, the Terrans lived in isolation for decades. In a relatively short amount of time, the 3 isolated groups of Terrans founded sister colonies upon their respective worlds. And although it would be at least 60 years before the 3 colonies would be reunited by space travel, each of them grew into prosperous, self-contained communities. Tarsonis, the largest and most technologically advanced of the colonies, soon developed second-generation subwarp engines. This allowed their ships to explore the myriad barren planets of the surrounding star system, and eventually led them to find the other survivors of the Long Sleep. Once reunited, the 3 colonies benefited from mutual trade and commerce treaties. Although Tarsonis kept pushing Umoja and Moira to join in a conglomerated government, the 2 colonies steadfastly refused. The fleets of Tarsonis continued to explore the Terran patch of space that came to be known as the Koprulu sector. Founding prosperous colonies upon 7 other worlds within the system enabled the military might of Tarsonis to grow by leaps and bounds. A new government christened the Terran Confederacy was founded by the Tarsonian colonies. The Moiran colony, which had benefited from having the largest resource mining operations in the sector, began to fear that this new confederacy might attempt to move in and regulate their lucrative operations. Thus, the Kelmorian Combine was formed, a shady corporate partnership that would supply military aid to any mining guild that was oppressed by Confederate policy. Tensions rose between the Confederacy and the Combine, leading to the outbreak of the Terran Guild Wars. The Guild Wars lasted for nearly 4 years, with the Confederacy eventually negotiating peace with the Combine. Although the Combine retained its autonomy, almost all of its supporting mining guilds were annexed into the holdings of the Confederacy. The Umojan colony, after seeing what blatant abuse the Confederacy was capable of, founded the Umojan Protectorate. This nationalized militia would work to keep its colony free from Confederate tyranny. In the final analysis, the Guild Wars assured the Confederacy its position as the dominating factor within the Terran power structure. The might of the Confederacy continued to grow as its prospectors claimed world after world with their reckless expansionism. Pirate groups and radical militia organizations began to spring up more frequently as Confederate enforcement agencies continued to abuse their citizenry. One of the greatest examples of revolt against Confederate policy was the Rebellion of Korhal. Korhal was one of the core Confederate worlds originally settled by Tarsonian colonists, a world of affluence and enlightenment. Korhal contributed greatly to the military and technological advancements of the Confederacy. Although the Confederacy benefited from Korhal's continued productivity, the citizens of the colony resented their forced affiliation with the oft-corrupt Confederate senators. Attempting to retain their independence, the citizenry of Korhal instigated numerous riots against the local Confederate militia. The Confederates responded in kind and declared martial law throughout the colony. This only seemed to agitate the populace even more, escalating the already rampant civil chaos. The Confederates believed that if their most treasured and pampered colony could turn against them, then all of their other colonies might revolt as well. It was decided that the crisis on Korhal would be ended by any means necessary. Korhal would serve as a chilling example to all the colonies in the Confederacy. A dynamic Korhalian senator by the name of Angus Mansk took it upon himself to formalize the sentiments of his fellow citizens. Their cry for freedom was undeniable when Minsk actively declared war against the Confederates. Oh, I started talking a little Minsk there. Whipping the people of Korhal into a volatile patriotic frenzy, the senator succeeded in capturing all the Confederate outposts in Korhal, issuing statements declaring that the Confederacy no longer held any claim over the world of Korhal. Manx succeeded in garnering the respect and admiration of many other struggling colonies. The Confederates, seeking to contain the situation, pulled their forces from Korhal and withdrew their fleets from its skies. Manx and the other leaders of the revolt, believing that they had won their independence, celebrated their victory over the Confederacy. The Confederates, knowing that a perceived loss to Korhal might instigate other colonies to revolt, planned to retake the planet through subtler means. The Confederates sent 3 of their deadliest assassins, known only as Ghosts, to eliminate Mansk and his supporters on Korhal. The senator's decapitated body, along with those of his wife and young daughter, were found the next morning on the private colony of his towering fortress-like headquarters. Mansk's head was never found. While the assassination did much to weaken the revolt on Korhal, it also fueled the fires that would eventually forge the greatest enemy the Confederacy would ever know. Arcturus Mansk. Before we continue, quick little note. One of those 3 ghosts that was sent to kill Angus Mansk was some woman by the name of Sarah Kerrigan. Yeah. Arcturus Manx, an accomplished Confederate prospector and businessman, did not take the news of his family's death well. Having been a prospector for years, Arcturus knew of the despicable lengths that the Confederacy would go to in an effort to reach its objectives. He was uninterested with greater sector politics and was even alarmed and somewhat embarrassed by the actions of his estranged father on Korhal. He never dreamed, however, that his family would be killed merely to prove a point. Their death stirred something inside the young Arcturus, leading him to forsake his promising future and follow a lonely path of vengeance. Remember that for later. Rallying the various militant groups that had followed his father against the Confederates, Arcturus succeeded in fashioning an impressive yet somewhat ragtag army. Manx's followers struck boldly at various Confederate bases and installations, costing the Confederacy billions of credits in men, machines, and equipment. With rumors spreading of a secret alliance between Manx's group and the Umojan Protectorate, the Confederate government quickly decided on a final solution to their problem. A salvo of 1,000 Apocalypse-class nuclear missiles were fired at the planet of Korhal from the distant Confederate capital of Tarsonis. Over 4 million people were annihilated during the savage attack. In a single instant, the prosperous colony of Korhal was reduced to nothing more than a superheated sphere of blackened gas and stirring phantoms. Kind of impressive that later on we see Korhal basically rebuilt to be a prosperous Dominion Empire, right? But yeah, the Confederates just decided to just nuke the planet. Just nuke the crap out of it. Yeah. Apparently Chris Metzen drew this picture. And since that's a vulture, I'm guessing that's our buddy Jim Raynor. The news of the Holocaust reached Minsk at a secret base located within the borders of the Umojan Protectorate. With nothing left save vengeance, Arcturus and those gathered with him on that sorrowful day pledged a sacred vow to bring down the Confederacy at all costs. Calling themselves the Sons of Korhal, Arcturus and his renegade team of volunteers quickly made names for themselves as the most wanted fugitives in the sector. Striking silently and swiftly, the Sons of Korhal won countless victories over the Confederacy. But with every battle, won in the name of justice, Arcturus was portrayed as a madman and a terrorist by the Confederate-controlled media. Kind of ironic, considering that how Manx uses the media in Wings Liberty against Raynor, isn't it? He probably got that idea. It's like, well, they used to do the same thing to me when I was with the Sons of Korhal. I'll use the same method against Raynor. Most colonies refuse to house or provide services to anyone affiliated with the outlaw group, yet despite seemingly overwhelming odds and scandalous public opinion, Manx never gave up the fight against the Confederates. To this day, the Sons of Korhal continue to confound Confederate enforcement agencies as they work to bring about their mission of liberation for the sector. A lot of parallels between how Manx was during his Sons of Korhal days and how it ends up being for Raynor in Wings of Liberty against the Dominion, isn't it? The various colonial powers and pirate militias continued to spar with the Confederate forces. Although many of the groups were constantly at odds with one another, the overall Terran presence within the Caprulu sector continued to strengthen and expand. These petty squabbles would end soon enough as the Terran colonies found themselves caught in the midst of a struggle of epic proportions. Without warning, a fleet of 50 alien warships descended upon the skies over the outlying Confederate colony of Chowsara. The massive ships opened fire upon the unsuspecting colony, continuing to decimate every inhabited settlement on the planet. This unprecedented attack caught the Confederate forces by surprise, sending the shocked Terran fleets into disarray. Although they had never encountered alien species of any kind, they rushed quickly to defend themselves against this new mysterious enemy. The Confederacy launched a clumsy counterattack against the alien fleet as it made its way towards the second Terran planet of Marsara. The alien fleet, identifying itself as the Protoss, mysteriously withdrew its forces and spared the colony. Soon afterwards, a second terrifying alien presence was discovered on the outskirts of Marsara. These new insect-like invaders were very different from the Protoss that attacked the colony just a short time before. No Terran agency could account for the disturbing presence of not one, but two strange alien races within their colonies. Overcome by a collective paranoid terror and encumbered by their own political infighting, the hapless Terran factions could only watch as an ever-increasing tide of alien invaders made their way towards the heart of the war-torn Terran sector. Before we continue, I need a drink. That's better. So, yeah, we'll be, and that basically covers the history of what happened with the Terrans and how they ended up here in the Caprulu sector, and then it gives a overview of how the race works from a gameplay perspective with the buildings, such as the buildings being mobile, being able to pick them up, the different units that you can be able to make for them. Yeah, by the way, I want to read something real quick about stim packs. This is a big reason why I don't use stim packs. In fact, this may not be the explanation from the manual, but there is a more detailed explanation as to the negative effects as to what stim packs do. The newest versions of the marine-powered combat unit and a fire-bat heavy combat suit featured an in-field chemically delivery system filled with a powerful mixture of synthetic adrenaline and endorphins coupled with a powerful psychotropic aggression amplifier. When activated, the stim pack provides the user with greatly increased speed and reflexes. Some tissue damage may result. Side effects including insomnia, weight loss, tremors, grand mal seizures, mania, hypomania, paranoiac hallucinations, severe internal hemorrhaging, and cerebral deterioration. Yeah, no. No. Yeah, that's why I never use stim packs when I play Terran. No. That sounds horrible. And, more of the different Terran units. Battle crews are operational. We'll get there. We'll get there. What I do like is that then, if you're a little confused about the different factions that are going to be referred to later on, here you go. You get the Terran Confederacy, which includes the Omega Squadron, the Death's Head Legion, which is, that group there. Then you've got the Nova Squadron. Then you've got the Alpha Squadron, which is led by General Edmund Duke. We'll get to him later. And the Pirate Militias, including the Sons of Korhal, and the Emojin Protectorate, and the Kelmorian Combine. Remember these factions for later. The Zerg. Now, the history here for the Zerg in this manual, because the thing is, the Zerg's background and history has actually been retconned a bit. Especially when we got to Heart of the Swarm, because I'm pretty sure Xeris and the Primal Zerg are not mentioned once in this manual, but let's go ahead and take a look. The Grand Experiment. Driven to perfect their science of protogenetic evolution. I'm trying to do the Overmind's voice. It's very hard. It's such a great voice. The ancient enigmatic race known as the Zellnaga traveled to the distant fringe world of Ire. The vast jungles of Ire had produced the most advanced race that the Zellnaga had ever seen. Believing that they could steer the race's evolution to the pinnacle of physical perfection, the Zellnaga began to conduct their protogenetic experiments. The race that the Zellnaga would eventually name Protoss advanced rapidly and gained what their creators termed a distinct purity of form. Unfortunately, the Zellnaga pushed their experiment too far. The inherent essence and sentience of the Protoss developed far too rapidly, leading to bitter strife and division between them and their creators. The Zellnaga deemed that the purity of form they sought to create had been sullied by a conflict of essence, and thus decreed that the Protoss were in fact a failed creation. The Zellnaga abandoned their children and launched themselves into the void. Traveling thousands of light years into the burning core of the galaxy, the Zellnaga eventually settled upon the volatile ash world of Xeris. Okay, so here we go. The Zellnaga planned to continue their grand experiment of evolution, only this time they dismissed their tenets of physical form and focused chiefly on the pursuit of a distinct purity of essence. Residing in their massive ships high above the fires of Xeris, the Zellnaga began once again to challenge the wiles of fate. The Zellnaga were more successful with their second venture than they could have imagined. They labored to advance the evolution of the most insignificant life form on Xeris, a race of miniature insectoids known as the Zerg. Through Zellnaga protogenetic manipulations, the Zerg survived the torrential firestorms of their world and thrived. Although extremely small, worm-like, and possessing no ability to manipulate their physical surroundings, the Zerg adapted to survive. They developed the ability to burrow into the flesh of the less vulnerable species indigenous to Xeris, feeding off the nutrients contained within the spinal fluids of their hosts. The Zergs learned to parasitically merge with their host creatures. Once they became capable of controlling the metabolic and anatomical processes of their hosts, the Zerg used their new bodies to manipulate their surroundings. As the Zerg incorporated more and more host creatures into their fold, they began to assimilate their various genetic strains and processes. Starting to hear Abathur somewhere. Zerg chemistry began to mutate and adapt according to the volume of new genetic material being processed. However, as diverse as the range of host creatures became, there was always the undeviating drive to consume only the most evolutionarily advanced species encountered. The Zerg were innately selective as to which species they consumed, ensuring that at every stage of their development, they were at the top of the proverbial food chain. Any race that the Zerg came across that was deemed unworthy of assimilation was eradicated to further purify the strains. The Zellnaga soon made an alarming discovery. The original races assimilated by the Zerg were hardly recognizable after only a few generations of their inception. Somehow, the Zerg had developed the ability to supercharge and steer the latent evolutionary processes within the host creatures.
the host creatures fell prey to the effects of gradual physical mutations that caused all of the various strains to grow armor-piercing spines, razor-sharp limbs, and ultra-dense carapaces. Over a surprisingly short amount of time, the strains grew to resemble a terrifyingly ravenous and unified race. The Overmind. The Zellnaga, remembering all too well that their failure with the Protoss was a result of pushing the sentience of the fledgling species too quickly, decided to follow a different path with the burgeoning Zerg. Attempting to waylay the potential hazards of differing egos, the Zellnaga structured the collective sentience of the Zerg into a unified, amalgamated overmind. By the way, they keep using the term the Zellnaga. Keep in mind that a lot of this is mainly Amon. Just keep that in mind. The Overmind coalesced into a semi-sentient being that represented the primary drives and instincts of all of the Zerg strains. As time passed, the Overmind developed the rudiments of personality and advanced intellect. Although the Overmind directed the actions of every creature within the swarm, it did so through the use of secondary agents. The Overmind created a new strain of Zerg that could facilitate the communication of its whims. These cerebrates were massive versions of the original Zerg insectoids, and were engineered to process and carry out the various objectives of the Overmind. Each cerebrate had a unique objective, such as defend the hive, scout for potential strains, produce more warriors, or eradicate all life forms. The cerebrates were then empowered to build their own hive clusters and carry out their intended agendas. Over time, they developed personalities that corresponded to their primary drives. However, the cerebrates were still genetically incapable of ignoring or overriding the commands of the Overmind. The Zerg chain of command lengthened as new races were incorporated into the swarm. Cerebrates began to use secondary agents to communicate their orders as well. For the defense and productivity of the immediate hive, the cerebrates turned to queens to further extend their control over the swarms. The queens oversaw drone activity throughout the resource lines of the hives, and kept a vigilant watch over the building spore colonies of the collective. In times of battle, cerebrates called upon the overlords to directly relay their commands to the myriad warriors of the swarm. Overlords not only transported Zerg warriors into the fray, but also directed their attacks against their enemies. Just as the cerebrates followed the Overmind, the queens and overlords were incapable of disobeying the commands from their cerebrates. This rigid system of command kept the swarms at peak savage efficiency. As the swarms continued to grow and strengthen, the Overmind turned its thoughts towards its own future. It realized that within a few short centuries, its race had assimilated all of the indigenous life upon Xeris. It knew that to further evolve the swarm, the Zerg would need to leave Xeris. The Overmind began to reach out with its senses, looking for something, anything which would provide them with transport from this world. That opportunity soon arrived. A race of gargantuan spacefaring lifeforms passed through the Xeris system, and the Overmind called to them. Drawn to the barren world by this beacon, they were quickly assimilated by the swarm. The inclusion of super-dense hides and the ability to exist in a vacuum bolstered the genetic pool of the swarm. Soon the Zerg warriors were conditioned to survive the harshness of space. This pivotal moment in the development of the Zerg was not lost to the Zellnaga. The Zerg, despite having an extreme physical handicap, had succeeded in not only surviving, but in retaining the purity of their terrible overriding essence. The Zellnaga knew that they had achieved their goal. The fall of the Zellnaga. The pride in their achievements proved to be the fatal downfall of the Zellnaga. The Overmind, while slowly expanding itself into the void of space, became aware of the mighty Zellnaga, world ships hovering ominously above the skies of Xeris. The Zellnaga, having kept a constant watch on the Overmind, were horrified to find that it had actually severed their psychic link, effectively hiding itself from their view. With its need to consume driving its minions into a lustful frenzy, the Overmind launched the new spacefaring Zerg swarms at the unsuspecting Zellnaga. The ancient race did what they could to stem the tide of the ever-advancing Zerg onslaught, but in the end their efforts were in vain. Wave after wave of Zerg swarms hammered the reinforced hulls of the Zellnaga ships, with no signs of abatement. Within only a few hours the Zerg overran the defenses of their creators, and laid waste to the Zellnaga fleet. As the greater hull of the Zellnaga race was consumed by the raging genetic whirlwind of the Zerg, the Overmind gained the knowledge and insights of its masters. The Overmind processed thousands of sentient beings into itself, causing it to grow far more powerful than it had ever imagined. It learned the secrets of the sacred Kadaran crystals, and began to incorporate the energies of these crystals into its own. Though the intimate knowledge of evolution and protogenic physiology gained from the Zellnaga the Overmind was able to increase the level of sentience in many of the higher Zerg strains, while still keeping them fully under its control. Through dissecting the memories of the Zellnaga, the Overmind was made aware of the myriad races that had at one time or another been influenced by the ancient race. The Zellnaga had kept a detailed genetic history of each race, giving the Overmind a clear understanding of their respective strengths and weaknesses. Most importantly, the Overmind learned of an exceedingly powerful race that lived near the galaxy's fringe, known only as the Protoss. The Overmind knew that the Protoss and the Zerg would eventually be caught in an inevitable apocalyptic conflict. The Zerg left the lifeless burning world of Xeris and laid waste to every planet they found along their path towards the Protoss homeworld. As they progressed slowly through the trackless dark between the stars, the Zerg assimilated only the strongest of the races that they came across. The swarm continued to build steadily, ever increasing in size and power as they progressed. The Overmind sent out numerous deep space probes that they scouted ahead of the swarm, searching for new worlds to plunder. Despite innumerable victories, the Overmind was greatly disturbed. The Overmind was aware that the Protoss had become a highly psionic race, able to bend and warp the very fabric of reality to their whims. It sought a way to counter the awesome might of the Protoss, but found no answers among the genetic strains that it devoured. There's a shot of a Hydralisk attacking a Marine. On the verge of despair, the Overmind made an amazing discovery. One of its deep space probes had relayed the location and vital statistics of a race that occupied a series of nondescript worlds right under the shadow of the Protoss. The new race, called humanity, was mere generations away from developing into a formidable psionic power. But the Overmind also knew that humanity was still in its infant stages, hardly capable of defending itself against the ravenous Zerg. Although a short-lived and seemingly frail species, the Overmind knew that humanity would be the final detriment in its victory over the Protoss. If it could assimilate the psionic potential of humanity, the Overmind would have the ability to combat the Protoss on its own terms. Thus, the Zerg swarm slowly made their way towards the burgeoning worlds of humanity. The journey lasted for 60 years, but eventually the massive extended Zerg swarm reached the outskirts of the Terran sector of Caprulu. Sending in a scouting brood, the Overmind soon discovered that the humans dwelt on over a dozen different worlds within the sector. Seeding the atmosphere of the planet called Chowsara with rudimentary hive spores, the Overmind began to unfold its master plan to enslave humanity. The hive spores gradually drifted down to the surface of Chowsara and saturated the ground with their denuding alien toxins. Although the human colonists had no idea that the Zerg had subtly infested the topsoil of their world, Zerg minions began to descend to the planet's surface and construct their bizarre structures in hive clusters. Once the infestation of the colony was well underway, the Overmind sent its voracious children to the other nearby worlds. Insidious and elusive in their tasks, the agents of the Overmind soon infested the colonial worlds of Chowsara.
Marsara, Brontis, and Dylar IV, unnoticed by the denizens of those colonies. Yet, from out of the cold void of space, a mighty fleet of Protoss warships emerged to combat the Zerg invasionary forces. The Overmind, anxious to learn what it could about the enigmatic Protoss, decided to let them hamper the initial infestation process. Holding its ravenous warriors at bay, the Overmind watched as the Protoss razed the colony of Chasara. Apparently, the Protoss were aware that the hive spores had already despoiled the planet, and seeking to prevent further infestation, incinerated the planet. Such decisive action pleased the Overmind, who could not only marvel at how the Protoss wrought absolute devastation with such grace and power, knowing that the coming conflict would be the greatest challenge of its existence, the Overmind pulled its forces back to observe how the Protoss and humanity would react next. Then we get an overview of how the Zerg function and the different units. Gameplay stuff here, including infested marines. Oh, aren't those lovely? Boy, yeah, that's supposed to be an Ultralisk. Yeah, I think they look better in 2. I think a lot of the units look better in 2. Forgive me, but yeah, I'm gonna be gushing about StarCraft 2. I love StarCraft 2. If there are those of you who hate StarCraft 2 who have a problem with that, you may not want to watch this series or this channel. And now for the Protoss. Although only fragmented documentation remains, an ancient Protoss text speaks of a highly advanced race that ruled over thousands of worlds in the galaxy. Tens of millions of years ago, this enigmatic race, often called the Zellnaga, or Wanderers from Afar, was rumored to have seeded and cultivated thousands of various species on the cold and barren worlds within their domain. Protoss traditions hold that the Zellnaga were a peaceful and benevolent race. That's funny. Utterly consumed with the study and propagation of sentient evolution within the universe. Nothing is known of the origin of the Zellnaga, save that they were not native to the galaxy, over which they held sway. Obsessed with fashioning the perfect life form, the Zellnaga labored to create a creature that would be defined by a distinct purity of form. Yeah, we'll get to this later. They touch upon this actually in the games. But yeah, it became very clear, especially in Legacy of the Void, the Zellnaga. An easy comparison for them is like the Reapers from Mass Effect. I've also heard them compared to the Gaul or the Graul. I think it's from Star Trek. I might be wrong. Or Deep Space Nine. Yeah. So, anyways. Looking for my place. Where was I? For thousands of years, they carefully steered the delicate evolutionary processes of their budding species. Although their protracted experiments produced many intriguing deviants and mutations, the races that the Zellnaga cultivated always fell short of their enormous expectations. Despairing at last, the Zellnaga focused their frustrated efforts on the most promising of their engineered worlds. Ire, a massive jungle world on the galaxy's fringe, had born a race of highly advanced beings. These beings were incredibly adaptable to harsh natural conditions and climates. Their strength and speed were unparalleled amongst the other races known to the Zellnaga. The race had even developed a rudimentary tribal society based upon group hunting and warrior rule. However, their most distinct aspect was that they communicated with each other through a very complex method of instinctive telepathy, allowing them to operate communally with striking efficiency. The Zellnaga were pleased with the progress of their latest creation, and conceded that the new race was the first of all their experiments to evolve beyond the feral constraints of baser life forms. To signify their ascension in the galactic order, the Zellnaga gave the new race the name of Protoss, or the Firstborn. I need a drink. Been reading for almost an hour. My throat's starting to get a little sore.
The early Protoss lived in harmony and seclusion upon the world of Ire for hundreds of generations, never knowing of the Zellnaga who watched over them from afar. Although the Protoss were the most advanced species to arise, the Zellnaga were still unsatisfied with their slow progress, and saw fit to drive the Protoss' evolution even further. The Zellnaga spent yet another millennium subtly guiding the steps of their children, eventually succeeding in leading the Protoss to the state of total sentience and awareness. The firstborn gradually became highly intellectual and introspective, achieving great heights in not only their cultural advancements, but personal individualistic advancements as well. Exhilarated by their seeming success, the Zellnaga finally made themselves known to the Protoss, never suspecting the chaos that was to come. The Departure and the Aeon of Strife. The Protoss civilization spread across the face of Ire within only a few thousand years, eventually culminating with the warring tribes settling under a centralized rule. In an attempt to discern the full extent of their creation's evolution, the Zellnaga had come down from the heavens and integrated themselves into the Protoss culture. The arrival of the Zellnaga seemed to bring the scattered tribes even closer together as the overjoyed Protoss looked to their wizened creators for new truths and insights. The Zellnaga marveled at how driven the Protoss were to plumb the mysteries of the universe around them. The Protoss harbored an insatiable lust for knowledge that led them to develop radical progressive strains of scientific and meta-neural study. As their understanding and personal awareness grew, the Protoss became exceedingly proud and began to see more value in personal achievements than communal advancement. The more successful tribes began to isolate themselves from one another, each seeking to define their own roles, not only within their immediate society, but within the greater universe as well. As the tribes grew further and further apart, the Zellnaga reeled in frustration. They speculated that perhaps they had pushed the evolution of the Protoss too far, marring the purity of their creation. Many Zellnaga believed that the Protoss had lost their greatest strengths as individual egos arose to overpower the once primary communal link. The tribes, driven by individualistic pursuits, rekindled their own ancient principles and rights in order to set themselves even further apart from their brethren. Where once there was only awe and reverence for their creators, suspicions began to brew amongst the tribes regarding the interests of the Zellnaga in their affairs. As months passed on Ire, the Protoss began to shy from their Zellnaga teachers, and each tribe cultivated wild and unsubstantiated rumors of their creator's supposed treachery. Attempting to completely sever themselves from the rest of the race, the tribes began to lose the connection to their primal psychic link. This breakdown in the inherent empathy of the Protoss for one another did the most to dissolve the last remnants of unity and brotherhood amongst them. The severing of the psychic link was also the greatest sign to the Zellnaga that the Protoss had tragically lost the most fundamental element of their greatness. Believing that they had made a grave mistake in pushing their failed creation too fast, the Zellnaga made to depart Ire forever. The suspicious Protoss, at hearing of their creator's departure, reacted with a harsh, violent attack upon the Zellnaga's world ships. Many hundreds of Zellnaga were murdered by the raging Protoss, who only decades before had worshipped them as gods. The Zellnaga fended off the Protoss' reckless attack, and sorrowfully launched the greater number of their massive ships into the trackless void beyond Ire. The Protoss tribes, left confused and abandoned in the wake of the departure, turned on each other in despair. What followed has been recorded as the bloodiest, most violent civil war ever recorded in galactic history, the Aeon of Strife. The raging battles waged during the Aeon of Strife were fought by countless generations of Protoss, all bent on perpetuating the guilt and blame for their abandonment. Although few actual records remain from this lost period of Protoss history, it is clear that the Firstborn devolved into frantic legions of merciless killers. Driven by centuries of unthinking hatred towards their brethren, entire generations of Protoss lived and died without ever knowing the legacies of their past or of the primal psychic bond that their forefathers had once shared. It is legend that even the greater landmasses of Ire were devastated by the epic struggle between the maddened
So here's an apparent supposed shot of a Protoss kneeling before one of the Zellnaga, and you see the other Zellnaga there. Though, as we come to find out, that's not what the Zellnaga looked like, as we find out after Legacy of the Void. But anyways, of the Madden tribes, it seemed that the whole of the once glorious Protoss culture was precariously poised upon the precipice of total annihilation. Kala, the path of ascension. Although there were many different factors that led to the ending of the Aeon of Strife, one unprecedented discovery is cited with bringing about the radical changes of the Second Age. As the ancient vicious blood feuds continued to take their toll upon yet another generation of Protoss warriors, one eccentric mystic stumbled upon a pivotal insight. The mystic, whose true name has been forgotten in the annals of history, was eventually named Kas, or He Who Brings Order. Kas, having studied the archaic forbidden teachings of the Zellnaga, unearthed ancient monolithic artifacts known as the Kadaran crystals. The crystals, left behind by the Zellnaga, were fundamental in facilitating their protogenetic experiments. Kas was able to channel the primal energies of the crystals through himself, allowing him to access the primordial psychic bond of his race. For the first time in thousands and thousands of years, because Blizzard loves to use giant numbers when it comes to time, the primal chord of the Protoss was tapped. Flooded by emotions emanating from every member of his race, Kas became aware that the Protoss had not lost their primal link, but had simply forgotten how to attune themselves to it. Horrified by the warring emotions that had been tearing his race apart for countless centuries, Kas began to search for a way to heal the searing pains of his people. Kas, gathering many young Protoss together, was able to teach the new generation of warriors how to access their latent psychic bond. These young ones, suddenly freed to distance themselves from the horrendous strife around them, were able to see clearly that the conflict of their race was folly. They believed that the Zellnaga had been right to abandon them, and that because their racial essence had been corrupted by the rise of ego, they were indeed a failed creation. They maintained, however, that because their inherent failure was not of their own doing, the inner conflict of the Protoss and racial turmoil was baseless and hollow. Kas developed a radical system of psychic progression that he hoped would discipline the new generation and keep them from repeating the tragic mistakes of their ancestors. His theory, known as the Kala, or Path of Ascension, called all Protoss to forsake their own whims and strive to reunify their once mighty communal race. The greatest hope of Kas was that the Kala would instill a new sense of essence and vitality within the Protoss race. Slowly, many Protoss gave up their ages-old feuds and rallied behind the ever-growing legions of the Kalai. This marked the true turning point in the Aeon of Strife and led to the rise of the Second Age. As the terrible war subsided and the tribes once more began to heal and bond, the premise of the Kala began to permeate even the deepest, most fundamental roots of Protoss society. Remember this when we get to Legacy of the Void. It's going to be kind of important. Daful, the stewardship. The Kala, primarily meant to define a rigid system of behavior, also called a shift from tribal society to a caste system. All members of the Protoss tribes were split into 3 new castes: the Judicators, the Kalai, and the Templar. This shift worked to remove the last remnants of the old hostilities between the tribes and strengthen the resolve of the Protoss to embrace a new beginning. The Judicator caste was comprised of Protoss elders and statesmen, with its main responsibility being the governing of the Protoss under the dictates of the Kala's law. The Judicator Assembly was ruled over by a small group of elders known as the Conclave. Puh! The second caste, known as the Kalai, comprised the greater bulk of Protoss society. The Kalai caste represent the driving industrialists, scientists, and workers who continued to rebuild their homelands after the harsh conflicts of the Aeon of Strife. The third caste, called the Templar, were the holy warriors and defenders of Ire, who followed the Kala's disciplines to achieve ever-escalating principles of psionic power. Under the new leadership of the Conclave and their Judicator administrates, and armed with the zealous might of the Templar, the Protoss soon rebuilt their decimated world of Ire into a bustling paradise, with their growing prosperity leading them to rediscover many of the sciences and studies they had lost. The Protoss learned to travel amongst the stars. Over the course of only a few hundred years, the Protoss conquered hundreds of worlds within their corner of the galaxy, and spread the fruits of their great civilization to many of the more advanced races that they encountered. All in all, the Protoss inadvertently succeeded in reclaiming an eighth of the worlds once presided over by the Zellnaga. In keeping with the strict codes of the Kala, the Protoss took upon themselves the burden of the Daul, or Great Stewardship. Following the ancient traditions of the Zellnaga, the Daul, or Daul, I hope they say, I forget if they say that in the game. If they say it in the game, I'll try and pronounce it correctly. Called for the Protoss to protect and safeguard the lesser races that lived under their shadow. Unlike their predecessors, however, the Protoss refused to manipulate or interfere in the evolutionary processes of the lesser races under their protection. Ever vigilant against xenomorphic threats, the Protoss kept a close watch over their unsuspecting wards. But much like the Zellnaga, many millennia before, the Protoss kept their essence hidden from the lesser races in their care. Many hundreds of species grew and thrived on the various worlds within their space, never knowing that they were secretly guarded from on high. That part about, like, they wouldn't interfere kind of reminds me of what's it called from Star Trek? The Directorate, or the Great Directorate, something like that? You know, where they refuse to interfere or just kind of let nature take its course. It has an actual name. I forget what it's called. Forgive me, I'm not as much of a Star Trek fan as I would like to be. The Dark Templar. Although their new enlightened civilization grew and thrived, the Protoss Conclave kept a dark, shameful secret hidden from the masses. There were a few dissident tribes who refused to embrace the Kala, believing that their individual identities would be erased to further promote the Judicator rule. The rogue tribes were not hostile or militant, but they believed that the Conclave's communal agenda would be the eventual doom of their race. Again, keep this in mind for when we get to the game later on. Thus, the knowledge of the rogue tribes was kept hidden, for the Conclave believed that their abhorrent influence might spread throughout the Protoss society and destroy all that Kos had accomplished. Convinced that the rogue tribes constituted a palpable threat to the new order, the Conclave ordered the Templar forces to eradicate the dissidents. That's right, the Conclave ordered them to be murdered. Well, they won't join us, so kill them all! Yeah. The Templar, led by a young warrior named Adun, could not bring themselves to slaughter their wayward brethren. Instead, the idealistic Adun attempted to hide the rogue tribes away from the sight of the Conclave. Adun believed that he could convince the rogues of the Kala's truth by teaching them how to manipulate their own latent psionic powers. Although their powers equaled those of the mighty Templar, the rogues still refused to submit their passionate, free spirits to the Kala. Without the discipline of the Path of Ascension, the powers of the rogues spiraled out of control and unleashed horrible, devastating storms across the fields of Ire. The Conclave, shocked that the Templar had not destroyed the rogue tribes, attempted to salvage the desperate situation. If the Conclave punished Adun and the Templar for their insubordination, it would be forced to publicly admit the existence of the rogues. Thus, the Conclave decided to banish the wayward tribes from Ire forever. The Templar, under Adun, were sworn to silence as the rogues were loaded onto an ancient but functional Zellnaga ship and launched into the void of space. Forever after the rogue tribes would be known as the Dark Templar. Over time, the legend of the Dark Templar spread across the face of Ire, sparking the imaginations of many young Protoss. To show their disdain for the Conclave and their Judicator lackeys, the Dark Templar ceremoniously cut off their nerve cords. And I think that right there is, I think that's Zeratul, actually. You can tell from the shoulder piece and the cape there on his arm. Yeah, that looks very much like Zeratul. It says they're they're nerve appendages, but we know they're later called their nerve cords, effectively severing themselves from the basic communal link that all Protoss share. It was widely rumored that since the Shadow Hunters were cut off from the primal cord of their race, they were forced to draw the psionic energies from the dark, cold void of space. This tale, above all others, worked to incriminate the Vagabond warriors for all time. Hunted and feared by their own brethren, the Dark Templar led a solitary existence within their spacefaring vessels. Traveling throughout the cold void of space, they never abandoned their love for Ire, and thus worked to safeguard their long-lost homeworld in any way they secretly could. Humanity and the coming of the Zerg. The Protoss bore silent witness to the portentous arrival of humanity to their edge of space. Although the Protoss were uncertain of the vagabond origins of the Terrans, they knew that these volatile, short-lived humans would prove to be an interesting study. Because that's how they saw the Terrans as animals. They're like, oh, that's an interesting animal. Let's observe it. Let's see what it's like. 2 centuries passed as the Protoss watched over the budding Terran colonists. The Terrans had succeeded in building up rudimentary colonies on over a dozen worlds within the Protoss' borders. Although the technology of the Terrans was far inferior to that of the Protoss, they adapted to the worlds upon which they lived and thrived. The Protoss found the Terrans to be fascinating, and that they could constantly fought against one another, and yet still flourished and advanced their technologies and industries by leaps and bounds. The Protoss were alarmed at how quick the Terrans were to access and drain the natural resources from their various worlds. Mainly the Confederacy. See, the Protoss saw the Confederacy and how they were just kind of strip mining every world and just, going completely nuts with their abuse of power, that they thought, well, the Confederacy clearly represents all humanity. Well, they're terrible. I mean, that would be like if they saw Hitler and they thought, so he clearly represents all of humanity. That's how this basically was for the Protoss. It seemed to the Protoss that the Terrans had no respect for the delicate balance of nature as they recklessly sped from one world to the next, leaving nothing but barren wastelands in their wake. Bidden by the strict dictates of the Daul, the Protoss were forbidden to directly interfere with the reckless Terrans, no matter how much they wished to do so. This disjointed relationship lasted for many years between the two races, yet a routine Protoss scouting mission found evidence that spelled certain doom for the hapless Terrans. The High Templar, Tassadar, accompanied by his renowned Templar expeditionary force, found a number of small biological constructs floating near the borders of Protoss space. Upon close inspection, Tassadar deduced that the rather nondescript alien organisms were in fact deep space probes. Although Tassadar could not discern their point of origin, it was clear that they were heading towards the Kapulu sector of Terran colonies. Tassadar brought the living probes back to Ire for immediate study. The strange aliens were unlike anything that the Protoss had ever seen before. The respective physiologies of the probes were apparently engineered for deep space travel and reconnaissance. In an attempt to discern their primary quarry, the Protoss focused the energies of the Khadarian crystals through the tiny minds of the probes. The Protoss were shocked to discover that the alien probes responded quickly and naturally to the powerful energies of the crystals. Excuse me. Their shock was garnered from the fact that only creatures born of the Zellnaga's protogenics could properly process the energies of the great crystals. More alarming was the vague thought stream that kept repeating over and over through the tiny brains of the probes. Find humanity. Eradicate. Learn. Evolve. The Protoss speculated that the probes were the harbingers of a bold new threat to their section of the galaxy. If the creatures were engineered with Zellnaga technologies, they would be very advanced and extremely powerful. It seemed clear to the Protoss that this new race constituted a palpable danger to all living beings, and that wherever the greater bulk of the race was, it must still be searching for the unsuspecting colonists. The Protoss began to send out advanced scouts to scour the surrounding spaceways for any sign of the alien invaders. Tassadar claimed that under the dictates of the Daul, it was the chosen responsibility of the Protoss to protect the races under their watch. The Conclave, however, argued that if the worthless race of Terrans had already been infested by some new threat, They must be put to the flame and eradicated. A great debate began between the Adjudicators and the Templar as to how they should involve themselves in the Terrans' imminent plight. The one fact that both castes agreed upon was that the creatures were undeniably engineered through the Zellnaga sciences, and if they were indeed created by the Ancient Ones, the Protoss had best be on their guard. It was agreed to send Tassadar and his expeditionary force to monitor the Terran worlds and attempt to discern the severity of the impending danger. To this end, Tassadar led his command ship, the Gantrathor, and an escort of massive Protoss warships towards the Terran sector of Kaprulu. The beginning of the end. Upon arriving in the Terran sector, Tassadar's scouts found evidence that the mysterious alien threat had already begun to take its toll upon the Terran colonies. Upon closer inspection, Tassadar found that the fringe colony of Chowsara had indeed been infested by the alien organisms. The entire surface of the colony had been covered with a thick toxic substance that continued to erode the planet's crust. To make matters worse, the aliens themselves had either infested or slaughtered most of the human colonists. Tassadar, horrified by the colony's devastation, could only wonder why the Terrans had not already rushed to aid their besieged world. The Conclave, hearing of the colony's fate, immediately ordered Tassadar to burn the entire planet of its infestation. Knowing that the burning would eradicate all life on the planet, Tassadar sorrowfully obeyed his masters. The lumbering Protoss warships powered up their weapons and opened fire upon the unsuspecting colony. This costly ploy was successful in destroying the alien infestation, but there were still a few neighboring worlds that had no doubt been infested as well. Tassadar was ordered to burn those worlds and any other Terran settlement that had even the slightest possibility of infestation. While moving his fleet to the second infested colony of Marsara, Tassadar began to doubt the morality of his orders. The Terran warriors, caught completely by surprise by the initial attack of the Protoss upon Chowsara, launched a fleet of starships to intercept Tassadar's fleet. The Terran fleet prepared to defend the colony from the Protoss, just as Tassadar commanded his ships to pull away and withdraw. Tassadar, struggling with his inner doubts, could not bring himself to destroy Marsara, or the fleet that had come to protect it. He sought a way to defeat the aliens without arbitrarily wiping out humanity in the process. Thus engaged, Tassadar refused to follow the genocidal orders of his masters. Remaining with his fleet, far outside the range of Terran sensors, Tassadar waited and watched as the alien presence continued to encroach across the Terran wastelands. And then we get an overview about the Protoss and their units for gameplay, and their buildings, and I think there's a thing here about the factions. The tribes. So yeah, although the Kala has called upon the Protoss to forsake their ancient tribal society and embrace the new caste of Judicator, Templar, and Kalai, many still cling to the fleeting customs and trappings of the old ways. The various tribes remain intact only to remind the Protoss of the follies of their past. With the ascension of the Judicator as the ruling caste above all Protoss, the old dilemma of tribal separatism no longer threatens the greater society. The most distinguishable aspect of the tribes is that each sect of Protoss has its own unique skin shades, ranging from mottled gray to a dark aphotic blue. So, we have the Aras, part of the Judicator caste, the Akalai, Shalak. This is why you'll hear some Protoss be like, "Oh, Shalak, Akalai." Just kind of see stuff like that. The Sargus, the Aruga, the Furnax. And then we get our roster of heroes for the game. We've got, of course, Arcturus Mansk. We've got Jim Raynor, Sarah Kerrigan, Edmund Duke, Aldaris, who is 740 years old, Zeratul, Phoenix, Tassadar, the Overmind, Dagoth, Zaz, and some others, like Matt Horner, who will be playing in the first Terran campaign, and our good old buddy Artanis, who will be playing in the Protoss campaign in the first game. So, anyways, that is the history of the races and such from the StarCraft manual. When we return, we'll be starting up StarCraft Remastered. Stay tuned.